All right, we're live. Live from Occupy City Hall in Rockford, Illinois. We are going to continue conducting the Rockford reading segment that we have here. We are reading the Why We Can't Wait by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We are on... Oh, I think I lost the page. I don't know if I remember the page. Okay, I don't remember the page. Let's see if I can recall. Okay, we went through the beginning of chapter 7, the summer of discontent. Oh yeah, that we were speaking about. They came to an agreement. But then there were some acts of white vigilantism. Yeah, and then they began to. They were getting ready for the march and the march on Washington. Yeah. Okay. I ain't marked the page. I know I didn't. I know we didn't finish the chapter. We didn't finish the chapter. Let's find a good spot to pick. I think this is where we was at. No, historic. The task of turning bill into law. Okay, that we had read through that. Recognizing that I should have did this beforehand. I got to put more time into pre-production. My fault. Got to put more time into pre-production. Okay, we did read through that. Our nation was born. Yeah, we read through our nation was born through genocide. We read through that. Okay, we're gonna start. We're just gonna pick up on page 149. In the middle of page 149, we're reading Why We Can't Wait by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We're on chapter 7, the summer of our discontent. And again, what we're doing while reading this is we're reading through these different pieces of literature and trying to cross-reference how the issues that are being brought up in these pieces of literature interrelate to the issues that we're dealing with now, how some of the ideology or some of the tactics that are being some of the ideology that's being espoused upon and some of the tactics that may be being used, how those things can also be implemented into Rockford in 2021. We're also, as we go through and read these things, specifically with this book, one of the things that we have noticed is how a lot of the effects may have changed and look differently, but the causes are still there as far as the racism in this country and in this nation. And so even though it may not look like segregation or the Jim Crow did back then, it is a reason that Michelle Alexander has called mass incarceration the new Jim Crow, because some of those same ways that people were being some of the same ways people were being discriminated against in 1963, they may look different in 2021, but they're still having the same result. It's still ending up with a section of people in this society being marginalized, and being oppressed and being exploited. And so again, as we're going through and reading this is 1963. Another one of the commonalities has been seeing how many things that were mentioned in this book that still go on in the exact same manner as today. In one of the last passages we read, Dr. King spoke about a young man being killed unjustly by the police department. He said another black young boy shot by the police department unjustly. And it just reminds us that even in 1963, they were saying another when it came to police terrorism. And so here we are in 2021, still saying another as we wait for the findings, of the investigation into the shooting of Jose Gonzalez Jr. by the Rockford Police Department and into the lynching of Faustin Guaitigo inside of his home by the Winnebago County Sheriff deputies. Okay, let's pick it back up. The thundering events of the summer required an appropriate climax. The Dean of Black Leaders, A. Philip Randolph, whose gifts of imagination and tireless militancy have for decades dramatized the civil rights struggle, once again provided the uniquely suitable answer. He proposed a march on Washington to unite in one luminous action all of the forces along the far-flung front. It took daring and boldness to embrace the idea. The black community was firmly united in demanding a redress of grievances, but it was divided on tactics. It had demonstrated its ability to organize skillfully in single communities, but there was no precedent for a convocation of national scope and gargantuan size. Complicating the situation were innumerable prophets of doom who feared that the slightest incident of violence would alienate Congress and destroy all hope of legislation. Even without disturbances, they were afraid that an inadequate support by black people would reveal weaknesses that were better concealed. The debate on the proposal neatly polarized positions. Those with faith in the black people's abilities, endurance, and discipline welcomed the challenge. On the other side were the timid, confused, and uncertain friends, along with those who had never believed in the black people's capacity to organize anything of significance. The conclusion was never really in doubt, because the powerful momentum of the revolutionary summer had swept aside all opposition. Washington is a city of spectacles. Every 4 years, imposing presidential inaugurations attract the great and the mighty. Kings, prime ministers, heroes, and celebrities of every description have been feted there for more than 150 years. But in its entire glittering history, Washington had never seen a spectacle of the size and grandeur that assembled there on August 28, 1963. Among the nearly 250,000 people who journeyed that day to the Capitol, there were many dignitaries and many celebrities, but the stirring emotion came from the mass of ordinary people who stood in majestic dignity as witnesses to their single-minded determination to achieve democracy in their time. They came from almost every state in the Union. They came in every form of transportation. They gave up from 1 to 3 days' pay, plus the cost of transportation, which for many was a heavy financial sacrifice. They were good-humored and relaxed, yet disciplined and thoughtful. They applauded their leaders generously, but the leaders in their own hearts applauded their audience. Many a black speaker that day had their respect for their own people deepened as they felt the strength of their dedication. The enormous multitude was the living, beating heart of an infinitely noble movement. It was an army without guns, but not without strength. It was an army into which no one had to be drafted. It was white and black and of all ages. It had adherents of every faith, members of every class, every profession, every political party, united by a single ideal. It was a fighting army, but no one could mistake that its most powerful weapon was love. One significant element of the march was participation of the white churches. Never before had they been so fully, so enthusiastically, so directly involved. One writer observed that the march, quote, brought the country's 3 major religious faiths closer than any other issue in the nation's peacetime history, end quote. It was officially endorsed by the National Council of the Churches of Christ in the USA, the American Baptist Convention, the Brethren Church, the United Presbyterian Church in the USA, and by thousands of congregations and ministers of the Lutheran and Methodist churches. How do they be saying that? I don't know how they be saying that. I know what the word is, but I can't remember how you pronounce this. In the Archdiocese of New York, letters were read in 402 parishes, quoting Cardinal Spellman's call for accelerated activity on racial justice, with an additional appeal from the auxiliary bishop and vicar general of the Archdiocese, the Most Reverend. Long sentence. My fault, y'all. The Most Reverend John J. McGuire. My fault. I needed some water. I need to get a drink. It's crazy. It's a little chilly out here today, man. That's crazy too. In Boston, Cardinal Cushing named 11 priests as representatives to the occasion. In addition to the American Jewish Congress, whose president, Dr. Joachim Prinz, was one of the day's chairmen, virtually every major Jewish organization, religious and secular, endorsed the march and was heavily represented at the gathering. In unhappy contrast, the National Council of the AFL-CIO declined to support the march and adopted a position of neutrality. A number of international unions, however, independently declared their support and were present in substantial numbers. In addition, hundreds of local unions threw their full weight into the effort. If anyone had questioned how deeply the summer's activities had penetrated the consciousness of white America, the answer was evident in the treatment accorded the March on Washington by all the media of communication. Normally, black activities are the object of attention in the press only when they are likely to lead to some dramatic outbreak or possess some bizarre quality. The march was the first organized black operation which was accorded respect and coverage commensurate with this importance. The millions who viewed it on television were seeing an event historic not only because of the subject, but because it was being brought into their homes. Millions of white Americans, for the first time, had a clear, long look at black people engaged in a serious occupation. For the first time, millions listened to the informed and thoughtful words of black spokesmen from all walks of life. The stereotype of the black suffered a heavy blow. This was evident in some of the comment, which reflected surprise at the dignity, the organization, and even the wearing apparel and friendly spirit of the participants. If the press had expected something akin to a minstrel show or a brawl or a comic display of odd clothes and bad manners, they were disappointed. A great deal has been said about a dialogue between black and white. Genuinely to achieve it requires that all the media of communication open their channels wide as they did on that radiant August day. As television beamed the image of this extraordinary gathering across the border oceans, everyone who believed in man's capacity to better himself had a moment of inspiration and confidence in the future of the human race. And every dedicated American could be proud that a dynamic experience of democracy in their nation's capital had been made visible to the world. So as we close off the chapter 7 of Why We Can't Wait by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that chapter is called The Summer of Our Discontent. We get ready to come up on chapter 8, which is The Days to Come. But I'd like to do a small reflection on some of the things we read in chapter 7. I'm not sure if I've done that in some of the other times, but we did read this chapter very sporadically. At the beginning of this chapter, Dr. King spoke about the young man who was the victim of the gas chamber, and his last words as he was dying. His last words as he was dying was Joe Louis. He was calling out for Joe Louis to save him. And Dr. King was speaking about how the desperation of the black community, that when this young man was dying, that was who he was calling out for. That's who he thought could help him. That was the only person he thought could help him was Joe Louis, was the heavyweight champion of the world. And so Dr. King speaks about how black people then as time passes, as these things are happening in Birmingham, not just in Birmingham, but as the nonviolent direct action becomes the primary source of a protest, the primary source of struggle for the black community in this time, how the mind state was changing with that, how the empowerment was coming along with that. He's speaking about how this is one of the things we were talking about last night when we were speaking about the RPS school district lawsuit. But the psychological effects of slavery, the psychological effects of racism and discrimination are very deep. They're very deep. And it's an aspect that is not explored nearly as much as it should be, and it's not spoken to nearly as much as it needs to be for us to be able to. Because again, all of these things must first be adequately addressed before they can be adequately absolved. We will never be able to absolve our society of some of these ills, of some of these isms, of some of these wrongs if we are not addressing them. So that was some of the things he spoke about at the beginning, is overcoming some of those psychological effects of slavery. Dr. King spoke about Bunker Hill and used the metaphor for Bunker Hill, saying that even though the Battle of Bunker Hill was essentially lost, it became symbolic for the American Revolution going forward, and it became the things that happened and the actions that were taken at Bunker Hill set the tone for the American Revolution, and so that sometimes even in losing, you can win. And so that was, so that was one of the things that he spoke about as well. He goes on to speak about the importance of anchoring, changing legal actions with changing the consciousness of the society, which is which is a common theme throughout the book. Then eventually he goes into, again, speaking into the some of the issues that happened once the campaign in Birmingham was being wrapped up. He speaks about how white vigilantism began to happen, and that began to put at risk the some of the agreements that were made surrounding the campaign in Birmingham. And again, that's something that we spoke about still seeing being relevant now. White vigilantism in America. And so those are a few of the things that was touched on Chapter 7 that we didn't touch on specifically in this part, specifically in this live. And so we're gonna go ahead and keep on going through the book and start with Chapter 8. So we are on Chapter 8, The Days to Come, the bottom of on page 154 of this version of the book. Again, we are reading Why We Can't Wait by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. As part of the Rockford readings out here at Occupy City Hall in Say Their Name Square. And we just reading through this literature and cross-referencing how the issues being presented connect with the issues we're facing today in Rockford, Illinois. 150 years ago, when the black people were a thing, a chattel whose body belonged to their white master, there were certain slave owners who worked out arrangements whereby a slave could purchase themselves, and become freed people. An enterprising young man who became enamored of a slave sweetheart worked desperately in what time he could find away from his labors and, over a period of years, amassed sufficient capital to earn his own liberation and that of his betrothed. Many a black mother, after toiling from dawn until sundown, would spend the remainder of the night washing clothes and putting away the pennies and nickels so earned until, with the passage of years, a few $100s had been accumulated. Often she struggled and sacrificed to purchase not her own freedom, but that of a son or daughter. The hard-earned dollars were paid to the slave owner in exchange for a legal instrument of manumission which declared its holder relieved of the bondage of physical slavery. As this movement grew, some black people devoted their lives to the purchase and liberation of others. A servant of Thomas Jefferson worked for some 40 years and earned $10,000, with which she was able to obtain the liberation of 19 fellow humans. That's Thomas Jefferson, the slaveholder. Thomas Jefferson, the slaveholder, who raped his slaves, who had children with his slaves, who enslaved his children, and they have a high school in this city named after him. They send black children to a high school in which we are reading right now. Black people had to buy their freedom from this man. He seen black people as chattel. Their bodies belong to him. And they sending black folks to that school, and then they gonna and they got black boys running up and down basketball courts with Jefferson on their backs, with Thomas Jefferson on their chest. They got black boys and girls running up and down these courts. They got black boys running up and down the football fields with Jefferson on their chest. See, again, and that gets those are the psychological effects of white supremacy, of quote-unquote white supremacy, of white nationalism. And again, until we break each one of these chains, we can never be fully free from it. How can you send a young black children to Lincoln Middle School and then Jefferson High School and properly educate them? And remember this will have to be properly educating them, and for them to not want to not go to that school anymore, or for them to, by the time a child is in the 8th grade or 7th grade, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, no black child should have any desire to go to a school named Lincoln, or have any desire to go to a school named Jefferson once they're in 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade. And again, and that should be incumbent upon, I'm not trying to say that if a child is going there, they're wrong. That's not what I'm saying. I went to Lincoln Middle School and I went to Jefferson High School. But what I'm saying is that educating, proper informing would make it so that by the time a kid got into fifth grade, especially by the time a black child, any child got into fifth grade, I mean, a woman, why would a woman want to go to Jefferson High School? He's a rapist. He raped slaves. And again, but as long as we continue to do things blindly, as long as we continue to be willfully ignorant, as long as we don't stop being lethargic about the implications of these things on our society, these things, these ills that we deal with will continue. This racial injustice will continue. You cannot properly address racism and racial injustice in Rockford, Illinois, and in Winnebago County, and allow symbolisms of racism to continue, because it's symbolisms of white supremacy, of quote unquote white supremacy, of white nationalism to continue. And so we must get rid of the Lincoln Middle School. We must get rid of Jefferson High School. But let us continue. Still later, a few dedicated and humanitarian white men took a crusade to the public for funds to ransom black people from the degradation which their abductors had imposed upon them. Even James Russell Lowell, who was opposed to compensated emancipation, wrote to a friend, quote, "If a man comes and asks us to help him buy his wife or his child, what are we to do?" End quote. Quote, "Help me buy my mother," or quote, "Help me buy my child," end quote, was a poignant appeal. Poignant appeal. It brought the deep torture of black people's souls into stark and shocking focus for many whites to whom the horror of slavery had been emotionally remote. As one approaches the emancipation of today's black people from all those traumatic ties that still bind them to slaveries other than the physical, this shadowed footnote, this half-forgotten history of a system that bartered dignity for dollars, stands as a painful reminder of the capacity of society to remain complacent in the midst of injustice. Think about that when we start having these conversations of people remaining quiet and complacent as injustice happens around them. It's not unique to this generation. It's not unique to this time period. As far back as you go in America, America has been more overtly racist, more overtly bigoted, more overtly barbaric, and more overtly inhumane, more overtly unjust. And the majority of people have remained silent through those things. Again, when we say the majority of people, we have to understand that there are certain groups, certain marginalized groups, certain oppressed and exploited groups, which don't even have the option to remain silent. I think that's something that I always think about when we're out somewhere and somebody says, "Don't do this here," or "Why are you protesting here? Why don't you protest somewhere else?" That's not, I always think I don't have the luxury, or people don't have the luxury to feel like that about the issues we're speaking about. Somebody who lives in a community that's over policed doesn't have the luxury when they're in that community that's being over policed to say, "Why don't you go over police somewhere else? Why are you over policing here?" The issue remains with them. Black and brown people and marginalized people, oppressed, exploited people, these institutions are so deeply rooted and are so ingrained into our society. They don't get the option of, there's no customer service to call for police terrorism or mass incarceration or racial injustice. There's no way for people to try to get these things to be done to them a different day or done at a different time. And so when we protest and we demonstrate against these things, I also believe that there should never be a moment in which somebody says, "Well, you should do this at a different time," or "You should do this in a different place," or "You should do this in a different way." The moment that you have that thought, the next thought should be, "Well, why are they doing this?" And that is the get into the root of the issue. That's the important question to be asking, and that's the question that ends in justice. And that's the question you ask when you care about something, or when you care about somebody, or when you have empathy, is, when you have a child and your child is misbehaving. Yes, you want to stop the child from misbehaving, but you want to find out why the child is misbehaving, so that way it doesn't become a cycle or repetitive action. Or even if it's not misbehaving, if you're in a relationship with somebody, and the person you're in a relationship with is sad or is depressed, you want to know the reason. You don't want to just stop them from being sad. You You don't want to just stop them from being depressed. You want to know the reasoning. You want to know the root cause of what's leading to these effects, so that way you can help them to avoid that from happening again. When somebody is genuine about solving something, genuine about addressing something, that is what they address first, is the root cause. And we live in a country which has never genuinely addressed root causes. We live in a city which has never genuinely addressed root causes. Today's average American may well shudder to think that such tawdry transactions were acceptable to his grandparents' parents. Yet that same American may not realize that callous indifference to human suffering exists to this day, when people who consider themselves men of goodwill are still asking, quote, what are the black people willing to pay if we give them their freedom, end quote. This is not to say that today's society wants dollars and cents in order to grant the black people their rights. But there is a terrible parallel between the outstretched and greedy hand of a slave trafficker who sold a black person their own and the uplifted and admonishing finger of the people who say today, quote, what more will the black people expect if they gain such rights as integrated schools, public facilities, voting rights, and progress in housing? Will they, like Oliver Twist, demand more, end quote. And again, it's important for us to think about Dr. King speaking about these issues and talking about the fear of white America, of integration, of granting integration into schools and public facilities, and to granting voting rights, because we live in a time right now in which voting rights are being systematically and systemically removed. Voting rights are being removed, but they are discriminating. They are making legal discrimination is being passed in legislation in different states around voting in 2021, and Dr. King is speaking about it in 1963. In 1963, black people were demonstrating and protesting to have equal and fair rights to voting, and in 2021, in communities and in different states and in different cities, black people are in the process of protesting about having equal and fair rights to vote. And does it look the same as it did then? No, it looks differently, but the root cause is still there. When we speak about police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, mass incarceration is a tool that is used to suppress people's rights to vote. Legally discriminate against people having the right to vote. And then schooling, we were just reading that, and again, this is why this is why we organizationally felt it was important to do a deep dive into the RPS school district versus the People Who Cares lawsuit, because of the fact that in 1963 they were demonstrating and protesting for integrated schools, for schools to be properly integrated, because they understood the damaging effect that these unequal and unfair, these separate but equal, which were truthfully unequal, which made them unfair schooling systems were. And so in 1963, they were fighting for that. And then we're reading about a lawsuit that took place here through 1970, 1980, 1990, that people say to this day, if you went back and you filed this lawsuit again, you would win, because they're doing these same things. And so we see just how what happens when you just try to attack the cause, when you just try to attack the effect and not the cause, is they alter what the effect looks like. What is implied here is the amazing assumption that society has the right to bargain with the black people for their freedom, which inherently belongs to them. Some of the most vocal liberals believe they have a valid basis for demanding that, in order to gain certain rights, the black people ought to pay for them out of the funds of patience and passivity which they have stored up for so many years. What these people do not realize is that gradualism and moderation are not the answer to the great moral indictment which, in the revolution of 1963, finally came to stand in the center of our national stage. What they do not realize is that it is no more possible to be half free than it is possible to be half alive. And then again, we get to this a constant theme of of patience being preached to people who are living in circumstances that breed impatience? Is passivity being preached to people who are living in a circumstance which breeds restlessness? And so we see that is this is a tactic that is being used. This idea to try to tell the people protesting or demonstrating about something to just be patient, it'll come around. Just hold on, just wait, it'll come around. Or give it time, give it some more time. Even think about here. Here, one of the main things that this city was championing as their one of the main things the city was championing as their as the change that they were enacting were body cameras. And we stand here today, a year after May 30th, a year after some of these stories came out about them championing body cameras, and there's still no body cameras. All the police department here doesn't have body cameras. And so you see what happens. And since then, there have been three people have dealt with macroaggressions of violence at the hands of the Rockford Police Department, since they said they were going to get body cameras. And so if they would have, instead of trying to tell people to be patient, instead of trying to pacify people, if they would have acted with urgency and got these body cameras, we could be seeing footage of what actually happened these days, what actually happened on those incidents. But again, that's just in a sense, the well-meaning or the ill-meaning American who asks, quote, what more will the Negro want? End quote. Or, quote, when will they be satisfied? End quote. Or, quote, what will it take to make these demonstrations cease? End quote. Is asking the black people to purchase something that already belongs to them by every concept of law, justice, and our Judeo-Christian heritage. Moreover, they are asking the black people to accept half the loaf and to pay for that half by waiting willingly for the other half to be distributed in crumbs over a hard and protracted winter of injustice. I would like to ask those people who seek to apportion to us the rights that have always enjoyed I would like to ask those people who seek to apportion to us the rights they have always enjoyed, whether they believe that the framers of the Declaration of Independence intended that liberty should be divided into installments, doled out on a deferred payment plan. Did not nature create birth as a single process? Is not freedom the negotiation of servitude? Does not one have to end totally for the other to begin? It is because the black people know that no person, as well as no nation, can truly exist half slave and half free, that they have embroidered upon their banners the significant word now. The black people are saying that the time has come for our nation to take that firm stride into freedom, not simply toward freedom, which will pay a long overdue debt to its citizens of color. Centuries ago, civilization acquired the certain knowledge that man had emerged from barbarity only to the degree that he recognized his relatedness to their fellow man. Civilization, particularly in the United States, has long possessed the material wealth and resources to feed, clothe, and shelter all of its citizens. Civilization has endowed man with the capacity to organize change, to conceive and implement plans. It is ironic that, for so many years, the armed forces of this nation, even in time of war, were prisoners of the Southern system of segregation. The military establishment could tear a man away from his wife and child and reorient within weeks his entire mode of life and conduct. But not until World War II did the Army begin to conceive that it had the right, the obligation, and the ability to say that a white man in uniform must respect the dignity of a black man in uniform. We need a powerful sense of determination to banish the ugly blemish of racism scarring the image of America. We can, of course, try to temporize, negotiate small, inadequate changes, and prolong the timetable of freedom in the hope that the narcotics of delay will dull the pain of progress. We can try, but we shall certainly fail. The shape of the world will not permit us the luxury of gradualism and procrastination. Not only is it immoral, it will not work. It will not work because black people know they have the right to be free. It will not work because black people have discovered in nonviolent direct action an irresistible force to propel what has been for so long an immovable object. It will not work because it slows the progress not only of the black people, but of the nation as a whole. And so again, this is Dr. King speaking about the reason that patience cannot be preached in moments such as these. The reason that passivity cannot be preached in moments such as these. The reason that we cannot say give time. The reason that we cannot say time will heal this wound is because time itself is not a weapon against injustice. And again, very often in this society, in this American society, time has been used as a weapon to perpetuate injustice. Patience has been used as a weapon to perpetuate injustice. And so though we must be patient and long suffering in our determination to continue to struggle, we must not be patient and long suffering in changes coming, in alterations coming, in bringing about an end to injustice. We must always struggle. We must always struggle as if we want those changes to come tomorrow, as if we have the capability for those changes to come tomorrow. And again, one of the reasons we must say that is because we have seen what this nation can do when it is an impotence put upon something. With what happened with this pandemic with COVID, we've seen it firsthand. And so we need that same impotence put on ending police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, because those are the greatest pandemics in this nation at this moment. As certain as it is that a planned gradualism will not work, neither will unplanned spontaneity. When the locomotive of history roared through the 19th century and the first half of the 20th, it left the nation's black masses standing forlornly at dismissal terminals. They were unschooled, untrained, ill-housed, and ill-fed. The scientific achievements of today, particularly the explosive advance of automation, may be blessings to our economy, but for the black people they are a curse. Years back, the black people could boast that 350,000 of their race were employed by the railroads. Today, less than 50,000 work in this area of transportation. This is but a symbol of what has happened in the coal mines, the steel mills, the packing houses, and all industries that once employed large number of black people. The livelihood of millions have dwindled down to a frightening fraction because the unskilled and semi-skilled jobs they filled have disappeared under the magic of automation. In that separate culture of poverty in which the half-educated black people live, an economic depression rages today. To deal with this disaster by opening some doors to all, and all doors to some, amounts merely to organizing chaos. What is true in the field of employment also applies to housing. We cannot tap the ghettos in order to screen out a few representative individuals, leaving others to wait in grim shacks and tenements. Nor can the vast ghettos of many cities be turned inside out in one convolutive gesture, spilling people of all varieties into one torrent to flow wherever the social gravity pulls. Either of these courses, gradualism or directionless spontaneity, would generate social turmoil both for the deprived and for the privileged. And again, when you read through that paragraph and you start thinking about what gentrification has done in communities, in black and brown communities in this nation, in poor and working class communities in this nation, when you start to think about the fact that they have done literally that, what Dr. King is saying cannot happen, what Dr. King is saying in 1963, that you can't just the vast ghettos of cities be turned inside out in one convolutive gesture. And that's what they've done. They've destroyed project buildings and just scattered everybody out into different areas or different places. They've torn down neighborhoods and just scattered people out to different areas and different places. And so when you think about in 1963, Dr. King was talking about those things couldn't take place, that those things couldn't happen, that would be just as dangerous of a societal, dangerous for the society as the gradualism. You see how both of these things have been done. In some areas, they've used gradualism to exploit and oppress people. And in some areas, they've used the directionless spontaneity to oppress and exploit people. And again, this is something that is being written in 1963. being talked about in 1963, and here we live in 2021, and these things are happening not in one state or in a couple states or just in the South. It's happening around this whole nation. And then we get back into the neutrality of the people of goodwill, the silence of the people of goodwill, and how those things perpetuate the injustice. Solutions to the complex plight of the black people will not be easy. This does not signify that they are impossible. Recognizing these complexities as challenges rather than as obstacles will make progress if we freely admit that we have no magic. We will make progress if we accept the fact that 400 years of sinning cannot be canceled out in 4 minutes of atonement. Neither can we allow the guilty to tailor their atonement in such a manner as to visit another 4 seconds of deliberate hurt upon the victim. Think about that. Let's read through that again. Think about these last two sentences here. We will make progress if we accept the fact that 400 years of sinning cannot be canceled out in 4 minutes of atonement. And that goes back to that's as a nation. That's a nationwide aspect view of things, a nationwide vantage point. But that same vantage point is applicable to a specific perspective of Rockford, Illinois. And when you think about the fact that 30, 40 years of when we're speaking about the school board, the miseducation, the purposeful miseducation, the purposeful discrimination against black and brown students in this community. Doing that for 30 and 40 years can't be fixed in 3 and 4 years. Can't be fixed in 3 and 4 minutes. The ramifications that has through multiple generations can't be fixed in 3 and 4 minutes. When we start speaking about actually and adequately addressing and absolving police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, and when we think about that these things that are things that date back 60, 70 years, we won't be able to fix them in 6 or 7 months. We won't be able to fix them in 6 and 7 years. And at the same time, we cannot allow, while we are trying to fix these things, with the understanding it won't be 6 or 7 days, 6 or 7 months, 6 or 7 years, we cannot allow 6 or 7 more days of police terrorism to be enacted upon our community. We cannot allow 6 or 7 more days of mass incarceration to be enacted upon our community. We cannot allow 6 or 7 more days of racial injustice to be enacted upon our community while we are working towards ending the 60 or 70 years of those things. And we're working towards that with the understanding that it won't be a 6 or 7 month process. And see, and those are all the multiple layers of understanding this issue. And that is why we can't allow for any day to pass, any hour to pass, any minute to pass in which we are not actively struggling against these things. Recently, Roy Wilkins and I appeared on the television program Meet the Press. There were the usual questions about how much more the black people want, but there seemed to be a new undercurrent of implications related to the sturdy new strength of our movement. Without the courtly complexities, we were, in effect, being asked if we could be trusted to hold back the surging tides of discontent so that those on the shore would not be made too uncomfortable by the buffeting and onrushing waves. Some of the questions implied that our leadership would be judged in accordance with our capacity to, quote, keep the black people from going too far, end quote. The quotes are mine, but I think the phrase mirrors the thinking of the panelists as well as of many other white Americans. The show did not permit time for an adequate answer to the implications behind the question. Quote, what more do the black people want, end quote. When we say that the black people want absolute and immediate freedom and equality, not in Africa or in some imaginary state, but right here in this land today, the answer is disturbingly terse to people who are not certain they wish to believe it. Yet this is the fact. Black people no longer are tolerant of or interested in compromise. American history is replete with compromise. As splendid as are the words of the Declaration of Independence, they are disquieting implications in the fact that the original phrasing was altered to delete a condemnation of the British monarch for their espousal of slavery. American history chronicles the Missouri Compromise, which permitted the spread of slavery to new states. The Hayes-Tilden Compromise, which withdrew the federal troops from the South and signaled the end of Reconstruction. The Supreme Court's compromise in Plessy versus Ferguson, which enunciated the infamous, quote, separate but equal, end quote, philosophy. These measures compromise not only the liberty of the black people, but the integrity of America. In the bursting mood that has overtaken the black people in 1963, the word, quote, compromise, end quote, is profane and pernicious. The majority of black leadership is innately opposed to compromise. Even where this is not true, no black leader today could divert the direction of the movement or its compelling and inspired forward motion. And so again, the Dr. King is speaking about the dangers of compromise, speaking about the dangers of lacking moral integrity, of lacking the courage of your convictions, and then he points to all the times through American history in which compromise has been the method or the tactic that's used, and how that compromise not only was compromising the situation and was compromising justice, but it compromised the integrity of America. It compromised the ideals of America. When the Declaration of Independence was being written and they deleted the condemnation of the British monarch's espousal of slavery, that was a compromise that perpetuated slavery. The Missouri Compromise, in the Missouri Compromise, it perpetuated the spread of slavery to new states. That compromise destroyed lives. That compromise implemented injustices in new areas. So again, and that compromised the ideals of America. That compromised generations of black people and white people as well, who would live in a society that was more barbaric and was less humane, and that has direct and indirect implications on everybody in the society. There were white people who lived in a more barbaric society and ended up being killed because of it, or dealing with whatever repercussions, traumatizations, victimizations because of it. And the reason that the society was so barbaric and humane was because of the slavery that was being perpetuated, because of the injustice that was being perpetuated. You see, you can't have a society in which you can deem one set of humans 3/5, and you don't start to look at other humans for whichever reason as less than. You know, the black people may have been the people that they seen as 3/5, but they weren't giving women full rights. So maybe they seen women as 4/5, even though they may not have legally written that down. They obviously didn't see them as 5/5. They obviously didn't see them as 100% full human beings. You know, and again, these are the reasons in which we cannot stand idly by as injustice happens, because at some point that injustice will penetrate further and deeper and have a direct effect and a direct impact on us. But again, let's keep diving into this. Many of our white brothers misunderstand this fact because many of them fail to interpret correctly the nature of the Black Revolution. Some believe that it is the work of skilled agitators who have the power to raise or lower the floodgates at will. Such a movement, maneuverable by a talented few, would not be a genuine revolution. This revolution is genuine because it was born from the same womb that always gives birth to massive social upheavals, the womb of intolerable conditions and unendurable situations. In this time and circumstance, no leader or set of leaders could have acted as ringmasters, whipping a whole race out of purring contentment into leonine courage and action. If such credit is to be given to any single group, it might well go to the segregationists, who with their callous and cynical code helped to arouse and ignite the righteous wrath of the black people. Let me see something. My fault. In this connection, I am reminded of something President Kennedy said to me at the White House following the signing of the Birmingham Agreement. Quote, "Our judgment of Bull Connor should not be too harsh," end quote, he commented. Quote, "After all, in his way, he has done a good deal for civil rights legislation this year," end quote. It was the people who moved their leaders, not the leaders who moved the people. Of course, there were generals, as there must be in every army, but the command post was in the bursting hearts of millions of black people. When such a people begin to move, they create their own theories, shape their own destinies, and choose the leaders who share their own philosophy. A leader who understands this kind of mandate knows that he must be sensitive to the anger, the impatience, the frustration, the resolution that have been loosed in his people. Any leader who tries to bottle up these emotions is sure to be blown asunder in the ensuing explosion. A number of commentators have implied that a band of militants has seized the offensive and that the, quote, sound and sensible, end quote, leaders are being drawn into action unwillingly in order to keep control from being wrested out of their hands. Certainly there are, and will continue to be, differences of opinions among black leaders, differences relating to certain specific tactical moves. But to describe the meaning of recent events as the seizure of control by a few who have driven out the rest exaggerates the importance of the differences. The enemies of racial progress, and even some of his, quote, friends, end quote, who are, quote, for it but not so fast, end quote, would delight in believing that there is chaos up front in the civil rights ranks. The hard truth is that the unity of the movement is a remarkable feature of major importance. The fact that different organizations place varying degrees of emphasis on certain tactical approaches is not indicative of disunity. Unity has never meant uniformity. Again, and this is one of the things where I always tell people that organizationally, we don't feel as if everybody has to adopt our tactics. We don't feel as if everybody has to adopt our ideals or adopt our philosophies. Again, it was not just one set of things that got us here. It was not one set of ideals or one set of philosophies or one set of tactics that got us here. So there will need to be multiple sets of ideals and philosophies and tactics to get us away from this situation. And so I do agree with the concept that unity does not have to mean uniformity. But I also think that we have to develop the type of political awareness that we all understand that, and that even internally people don't start to believe that unity has to mean uniformity. But let's continue. If it had, it would not have been possible for such dedicated Democrats as Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, a radical such as Thomas Paine, and an autocrat such as Alexander Hamilton to lead a unified American revolution. Jefferson, Washington, Paine, and Hamilton could collaborate because the urge of the colonials to be free had matured into a powerful mandate. This is what has happened to the determination of the black people to liberate themselves. When the cry for justice has hardened into a palpable force, it becomes irresistible. This is a truth which wise leadership and a sensible society ultimately come to realize. And again, I think that's something that should be pressed upon more often. Too often people forget how this country was formed and was put together. And a lot of times the ways in which this country was formed and put together are ways that the government and institutions, there are things that they actively try to keep people from doing and from realizing, from understanding. When you realize how significant the Boston Tea Party was to the American Revolution and to American history, it makes it so that you can frame yourself in history when you're protesting to know that if the cause is the right one, is the morally correct one, or is the one that will be looked at as right in historical references, there is no ends that are too much. There are no ends that are not justified. That is if you're looking at what America was historically built upon. People speak about compromise or speak about being too militant or rushing too much, or come back later or stop or slow down, and again, give me liberty or give me death is not compromising. It's not slowing down. It's not being patient. It's not being passive. It's not taking a break. And that is the type of mentality that led to us being in this system. That's the mentality of the men who built this racism into this nation. It was not a mentality of half measure. It was a mentality of full measure. And so it will take the same type of mentality of full measure for us to reverse those things. In the current struggle, there is one positive course of action. There is no alternative, for the alternative In the current struggle, there is one positive course of action. There is no alternative, for the alternative will connote a rear march, and the black people, far from being willing to retrogress, are not even willing to mark time. In this revolution, no plans have been written for retreat. Those who will not get into step will find that the parade has passed them by. Someone once wrote, quote, "When you are right, you cannot be too radical. When you are wrong, you cannot be too conservative." The black people know that they are right. They have not organized for conquest or to gain spoils or to enslave those who have injured them. Their goal is not to capture that which belongs to someone else. They merely want and will have what is honorably theirs. When these long withheld rights and privileges are looked upon as prizes they seek from impertinent greed, only one answer can come from the depths of a black person's being. That answer can be summarized in the hallowed American words, quote, "If this be treason, make the most of it," end quote. The sooner our society admits that the black revolution is no momentary outburst soon to subside into placid passivity, the easier the future will be for all of us. And again, I think that is all of these things relate directly to where we are at right now in Rockford, Illinois. If this be treason, make the most of it. When you are right, you cannot be too radical. When you are wrong, you cannot be too conservative. And so, ending on that note, we are on the bottom of page 164. We have, how many pages we got left? We're on the last chapter. So on the last chapter, we got about 30, 40 pages left. So again, we are reading Why We Can't Wait by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I'm going to make sure I mark our page. We're on chapter 8, The Days to Come, the last chapter of the book. Share this video. We outside.